Hello and welcome to my channel. I'm going to be doing this charcoal landscape or a path into a dark forest. I'm going to be using Master Touch woodless charcoal pencils, some willow charcoal and some other stuff. First, I'm going to do a little bit of planning. So, the line of the trees or the foreground area is going to be right about here at the bottom, and there's going to be a path here in the middle, roughly in the middle, and there's going to be some trees in the background, but we're going to have some layers of trees. Some of them are going to be slightly in front of others, so that should probably do it for the composition part. After that, I'm going to do a bit of shading. I need to shade the sky, but this is probably a little bit too much. But that's okay, I'm going to spread it out. I just use a bit of charcoal residue to shade the part of the sky which will not be obscured by the canopies of the trees. And I also added a bit of shading with a piece of willow charcoal where I wanted to make that a bit darker and a bit more even. Once I make that fairly even with a brush, I'm going to start drawing the clouds here. And I'm using a Kohinoor pencil eraser for this. Not an ideal tool. I know that Tumble Mono Zero eraser is probably thinner and far more accurate, but this gets the job done in most cases. So I'm just drawing some clouds here. And mind you, not much of this will be visible because some of it will be obscured by branches and foliage, but I just want to have a bit of sky over there in the background. Next step, we're moving closer to the foreground here, and in front of those taller trees in the background we're going to have some bushes and some shorter, younger trees. Now here at the bottom I used a bit of charcoal pencil, but I'm going to shade this large dark area mostly with a piece of willow charcoal. Willow charcoal is very soft, easily blended, and it's perfect for blocking in large areas. So if you want to define a large dark area, if you want to define large contrasts in your charcoal drawings very quickly, then you should use vine charcoal or willow charcoal. These are soft charcoal sticks, natural charcoal. It doesn't really stick to the paper quite as much as compressed charcoal, and it's more easily manipulated. Now I'm going to do a little bit more work with my charcoal pencils, because I need to get in there and draw some really dark areas in between the trees. So I'm using woodless charcoal pencils, and one of them is soft, the other one is medium. The one that I'm using right now is a soft charcoal pencil, which means that it's a bit softer and also a bit darker. It's the darkest thing that I have, and you can see that it's producing these pitch black areas, and to make sure that they're really dark, I push them in with my finger. Because sometimes when you use some other blending tools, that'll, like for example brushes, that'll tend to dig out some of that charcoal dust and make areas a little bit lighter during the blending process. The fingers don't really do that, they really allow the material to stick to the paper. But the problem with fingers is that they are kind of large and lack precision, in comparison to some of the other blending tools. Be that as it may, I can use my index finger here by twisting it and kind of push in the charcoal to create these darker areas in between the tree trunks, and still have a decent edge around the trees, which I can clean up a little bit later, either using my pencil to go around them or using an eraser. So now, as you can see, I already have some suggestions of tree trunks which are popping out of the dark, and now I'm going to draw some suggestions of lighter areas in those darker areas, so that I can make it look like there's a little bit of light coming through those canopies and through those trees. I don't want to make the forest completely dark. I need to create a feeling of depth, and in order to do that I have to create some suggestions that there are things behind the row of the trees in the foreground. So I just used my pencil eraser to draw some branches growing out to the sides, and now I'm going to do a little bit of this foliage. And when I say foliage, because these are coniferous trees, I mean clusters of needles or whatever they are. And I'm going to draw these with a pencil eraser again. Now I have to warn you, the pencil eraser has its limitations when working with charcoal. It really depends on how dark the charcoal is and how much you pushed it into the grain of the paper, because it's not always easy to erase clean. But there's a hidden advantage to that as well, because sometimes you can use your eraser to draw more subdued highlights. When it picks up a little bit of charcoal, you can still erase, but the marks that you're making are not quite as light, and you can use that to create a feeling of depth, making it look like some of those parts of the canopy are catching more light than the others, while others are in a shadow and they're catching less light. You can also see that I erased a little bit more from some parts of the tree trunk than from others, because I want to make it look like the light is coming through the branches, and the branches and the foliage is casting shadows onto those tree trunks. So some parts of those tree trunks are going to be lighter than the others. So I just made some suggestions of branches and foliage here, and so far it's looking good. These are, like I said, just suggestions of shapes. I am neither willing to draw very detailed specific shapes, nor am I able to do this. This is a smaller format, about A5 size, so around 6 times 10 inches or so, or maybe even less, I don't really know. Plus the eraser I'm using doesn't really allow for that much precision, and when you push in large areas of dark charcoal like I just did here, there are always limitations as to how light you can make your marks while erasing. So here in the background, in between the trees, I also make some marks suggesting that there is some foliage and bushes and branches there, but those are less visible, and this is where that dirty eraser is starting to work for me, by making those marks which are kind of darker and more greyish rather than lighter, and that allows me to create those shapes in the shadow which are barely visible, but still there, still enough for the viewer to get a feeling of distance and depth, like something is further or deeper inside that forest, or further and deeper in the shadow, further away from the light source. So as always, and I often talk about this when doing these landscapes, one of my main goals when I draw landscapes is to create a feeling of depth. I want to drag the viewer into the landscape and make them feel like they're looking at something that has 3 dimensions, something that has depth. And I want to create that illusion like some of these objects are in front of the others. The way you draw things and the way you shape things is not the only thing that you have to remember. The composition is also important. You have to stack your elements or arrange your elements in such a manner so that the elements in the foreground push the elements in the background and create that suggestion of depth. Now I'm going to be drawing some more trees here on the right of that group of trees. And I'm slowly working over the sky area. How much of that sky area I will cover, I don't even know myself when I do the sketch. But these are just some things that I work out as I go along during the drawing process. The kneaded eraser is another tool that I like to use, but not as much as the pencil eraser. Because the kneaded eraser can erase fine marks, fine details, but it doesn't work quite as well as the pencil eraser, because the pencil eraser can rub out the material, and it's also more convenient because you can hold it like a pencil and you don't have to remold it. But a kneaded eraser can sometimes lift up charcoal in some areas and create some random and unpredictable shapes, happy accidents as it were, and that can sometimes help you when creating these canopies or maybe shapes of clouds and things like that. So both types of erasers are very useful when drawing landscapes. I'm drawing some more trees here in front of these clouds, in front of the sky. Don't worry if the shapes don't look great right now, because I'm going to be adding some more trees there. Now here in the background I want to have some distant trees, and I drew these with less detail and some lighter value because they're further in the distance. In front of them, as you can see, I will draw some darker shapes, more defined shapes. And what that does, it creates contrast between these darker elements which are closer to our viewpoint and those lighter ones which are further away, because I'm trying to imitate the effect of looking at the distance, the atmospheric effect where things get lighter, more vague and less defined as you look further into the distance. And these objects closer to the foreground are going to be darker, there's going to be more contrast, and there's going to be more texture. So I'm going to push that charcoal in with my finger. I'm not really spoiling the shapes, I'm just kind of dabbing a little bit. I can always refine them a little bit more. I don't really need all of them to be super defined, I just need them to be a little bit darker right now. By the way, for that darker area in the middle, I used a soft charcoal pencil again. Here in this drawing, I mostly used a combination of willow charcoal for the lighter shapes and lighter values, and a soft charcoal pencil for some of the darker values. But here I'm using a medium charcoal pencil. The short one in the pencil holder is my medium charcoal pencil. And I use that for some of the branches and some of the details and some of the smaller clusters of foliage here and there. So this is one of those rare pieces where I where I actually use the soft charcoal pencil a little bit more than the medium charcoal pencil, even though it's usually the other way around, because I like to use the soft charcoal pencil sparingly most of the time so that those darkest areas are more effective. But here I used the willow charcoal stick for a lot of the shading and created a lot of those areas of lighter values, and I was able to use that in contrast with the darkest areas I created with a soft charcoal pencil. And I felt that was enough. I'm just drawing some suggestions of lighter shapes in the foreground, like some of the lighter branches which are hanging down and sticking out and are a little bit lighter than their dark background, and also some smaller trees at the bottom. As you can see, some of the younger trees and maybe some bushes and some other foliage and stuff in the foreground. But I'm going to add one more tree here in the middle, because I don't really care how much of those clouds is visible through those canopies. I just, like I said at the beginning, I just put those in so that I can create a feeling of depth, like there is some kind of a background over there. Just going over that path and trying to give myself an idea where it's going to be and what its exact shape is going to be. Now I'm going to go back to drawing this tree in the middle, add some branches growing out to the sides and add some foliage on them, and maybe add some suggestions of lighter areas, maybe some light coming through the canopies, or maybe some lighter branches here and there. And I can also go back in and add some darker bits here and there where I feel like maybe I need a bit more depth or a bit more value. Here in the foreground on the right, that's the midground, isn't it? I'm going to draw another tall tree in front of these, and I'm going to make it look like some of its foliage and branches is just popping into the frame. I guess I'm doing this just to make the drawing a little bit more balanced. Here I'm just going to draw another lighter tree in front of this group of trees, but here I'm at a point where my pencil eraser is really short and really dull, and it's not really lifting up much charcoal, to be honest. I'm just trying to draw some of these lighter shapes in the foreground, but as you can see, much of the scene is already done. Probably the most important thing about this scene, when you first look at it, is the contrast between the tree trunks and the darker background, the dark foliage. That's what really creates depth there. And then when you go a little bit deeper into the details, you look at the lighting and the shadows on the tree trunks, and you see that some of the branches are casting shadows onto the tree trunks, and that some part of the tree trunk are very much lighter than the background because they're catching light from the light source, and that makes it all the more realistic. So this is a very simple scene, something that you can probably do in an hour and a half or so. Really depends on how much you want to refine it or how much work you want to put into it. But it's a simple scene that's also very effective, I think, because of the way that the elements are arranged and because of those strong contrasts. Time to do a little bit more work on this foreground area. As you can see, as I'm drawing some suggestions of clumps of grass and then softening them with a brush, and then adding some areas of even darker value using a combination of willow charcoal and my compressed charcoal from charcoal pencils, and even dragging my piece of willow charcoal just to create some random shapes and random suggestions of areas of darker value. On top of that, I can draw some lighter marks with a pencil eraser, drawing some larger clumps of grass, drawing some irregular shapes on that dirt path which is leading into the forest, maybe drawing even some flowers and the foliage of some bushes in the foreground. I don't really need to explain every single detail to the viewer. Some of these things can just be left to the imagination. And one of the things that I'm trying to do right there in the middle, where the road enters the forest, is I'm trying to have a little bit of shadow, overlapping areas of shadow and light, so that I can make it look like some parts of that path are still visible in the forest, because the trees are casting a bit of shadow over the path. So we have some areas of lighter and darker value. I'm just removing those pieces of tape around the corners and wrapping things up. Adding a bit of shadow here on the grass on the sides of the road, so that the grass can stick out or feel like it's raised above the level of that dirt road. Just finishing those corners, and the scene is almost done. Just going to be putting some finishing touches here and there in the midground and the foreground area. And now the drawing is done. I'm just going to put my signature in the lower right corner, and that, I think, is it. So a nice little scene in charcoal. I hope you enjoyed the drawing process. Don't forget to give me a like, subscribe and comment, and also don't forget to check out my Patreon for additional content and longer videos. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.